Next is item 317. Assemblymember Manchin.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Again, I would like to open by thanking the Chair and committee staff for working to strengthen this bill with the committee amendments, and we will gladly accept those amendments as authors' amendments. States can be overwhelmed when impacted by a disaster, as seen in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey. The need for temporary shelters was made clear in the Gulf states during Hurricane Katrina and Rita. And then again in 2011 when Hurricane Sandy slammed into the East Coast. Just using Sandy, for example, it displaced thousands of people and pets, caused nearly 300 deaths, and plunged parts of the U.S. Into darkness for weeks. These events show that even states as diverse as New York, Louisiana, New Jersey, and Mississippi can be overwhelmed when disaster strikes and require assistance from out-of-state responders. Many people who have lost their homes have to move to shelters that do not allow animals. So responding animal welfare agencies like the ASPCA establish temporary shelters to house these animals along with stray animals. Recent polls have shown that over 40% of Americans would not evacuate their homes without their pets. They would rather face this danger with their pets than simply abandon them, complicating efforts to respond to a disaster. This bill is a crucial step towards ensuring the well-being of California's pets and animals in the wake of natural disasters. Once again, I have with me Kevin O'Neill of the ASPCA and Christy Woods, who's Director of State Government Relations for the American Red Cross.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. In the wake of Katrina, a poll found that 44% of New Orleans residents would not evacuate because they could not take their animal with them. Similarly, an ASPCA poll found that 46% of Americans won't evacuate if they can't take their animal with them. Having temporary shelters where individuals who own pets can go and make sure that their animals are being treated well and cared for is critical in making sure that individuals actually evacuate. Now, California law, I want to stress, California law already authorizes the state in a declared emergency to call in out-of-state veterinarians. So this bill is not creating a new exemption. We're not trying to authorize some new exemption here when it comes to the state's ability to do that. AB 317 simply clarifies that when you do call in those individuals from out of state, that they have the opportunity to utilize temporary shelters. The law, BMP 900, is not very clear on whether or not when veterinarians are asked to respond, if they can actually utilize temporary shelters. AB 317 does not change the mechanism for how the state calls in responders. It does not change the disciplinary actions that can be taken against anybody who responds. And it does not alter how the network of existing responders works in collaboration with one another during a disaster. In essence, we can only come in if we're invited. If a disaster happens, the ASPCA cannot just enter into California and start setting up temporary shelters everywhere. It has to be in connection with a call from those folks within the state that actually are the responders, which in this case would be CDFA, and we've had a good meeting with them about making sure that the bill is structured in a way where when we are asked to respond, that those shelters are done in a way that works within the confines of existing protocols. And this bill has a little bit of a special importance this year as we commemorate the 10th anniversary of Katrina next month, where we saw the level of devastation. It is estimated that 250,000 animals were impacted during that event. Not all of them were saved, and not all of them ended up in temporary shelters, but that was the estimate of how many animals. As many of us from Sacramento know, that in the wake of Katrina, there was much discussion over what would happen to the Sacramento Delta region if the levees failed here in a Katrina-style event. The AVMA reports that roughly half of Californians have animals at home and pets. The numbers would likely be much higher. So AB 317 is really about dealing with those types of catastrophes where you're talking about hundreds of thousands of animals. And we have great respect for the Veterinary Medical Board Medical Corps, Reserve Corps, that does great work and responds. They actually worked in Joplin when we deployed to Joplin during a tornado. So we've seen their work in action, and we respect what they do. We're simply saying that since the state has already decided that out-of-state veterinarians can be called on, that when they are, that they be allowed to use these temporary shelters, which we know through our polling data and experience that is extremely important in making sure that people actually evacuate out of disaster zones. So I thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. My name's Christy Woods, and I'm with the American Red Cross. The Red Cross chapters in California are pleased to support AB 317. The Red Cross is co-lead on mass care in our state in conjunction with the California Department of Social Services. Mass care includes sheltering, feeding, and medical assistance provided to large populations in time of disaster. As Kevin mentioned, people are less likely to come to the safety of shelters after a disaster if there's no place for animals. We frequently see people living in their cars in parking lots of shelters with their pets. It's always our goal to work with our partners to co-locate pet shelters next to human shelters to prevent this from happening. And in a catastrophic incident or even a mid-sized disaster, the surge in need will be great. In the Red Cross experience during a disaster, infrastructure can break down and you must improvise. We'd like to see another avenue of access and support for our animals. Most communities do not have data on the number of households that own dogs, cats, birds, or horses, nor do they have data on the numbers of these pets in their community. We do know from the 2011 Southern California Catastrophic Earthquake Response Plan that the Red Cross participated in jointly with the state of California that it is estimated that approximately over 500,000 individuals will need mass care and shelter support, while an additional 2.5 million individuals would need some type of support services, such as meals and mental health services. It can also be estimated that approximately 205,000 service animals and household pets will need support. Other plans, such as the Bay Area Catastrophic Plan and the Cascadia Subduction Zone Plan, far exceed these animal statistics. In order to meet the demands, spontaneous sheltering will need to be mobilized quickly, which AB 317 seeks to accomplish. We respectfully ask for your support. Thank you.
Additional witnesses in support? Witnesses in opposition?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Again, with apologies to Mr. Mainshine. Christina DeCaro, representing the California Veterinary Medical Association. CVMA is opposed to AB 317 because we believe that the need to override the current premise permit laws has not been demonstrated. And very much like the previous bill, we are concerned about unlicensed veterinarians coming into California to practice. And third, the bill has the potential to create some logistical problems for the state's very detailed animal disaster plans. On the first point, the CVMA believes that an exemption from a California veterinary premise permit should only be used when there is no other reasonable alternative. Sheltering an animal is very, very different than providing veterinary care to an animal. And both this bill and 316 are seeking to provide much more than food and water to these temporary shelters. They are going to be rendering veterinary care. The bill requires the premises to meet the Veterinary Practice Act minimum standards, but then exempts the veterinarians working at that temporary shelter from other provisions of the Practice Act as written. The bill also allows veterinarians to come in from out of state without obtaining a California license to work on the animals, and then after the fact, they would provide a report to the Veterinary Medical Board on the veterinary work that was done on that site. And we just feel that that's not sufficient protection for the animals or their owners if something should happen and the owner were to need to have some recourse. On the second issue, the state really has a very impressive and robust network in place that will address the care and treatment of animals should there be a declared disaster. The California Office of Emergency Services, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and the California Emergency Medical System Authority, among others, have very, very detailed plans in place for the housing and sheltering of animals during a major disaster. CVMA, in fact, is also part of the statewide structure, as 750 members of our California Veterinary Medical Reserve Corps have been trained under the state response system. Again, we question the need for the bill when the care and sheltering disaster protocols have already been established by the state through years of work and preparation. I was a bit confused by the sponsor's statement about the reference to CDFA. The code clearly speaks to CalEMSA's authority to call these folks in a disaster. But for these reasons, the CVMA is opposed to 317. And I do have in the audience, should you have any questions, Dr. Grant Miller, who is the head of our Veterinary Reserve Corps, and he would be available to answer anything for you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon again. Anne Marie Del Manayo from the California Veterinary Medical Board. Again, the board has not seen the recent amendments to AB 317, but it is on record as opposing the measure for the same reasons that we opposed AB 316. Again, exempting these premises from oversight and inspection is a public health protection issue for the board. There are some very significant minimum standards that must be met, and while the sponsor and the author have agreed that they have no issue with the board's inspection authority, the bill does in fact exempt these premises from inspection. So the board would face legal challenges in ensuring minimum standards are met at these locations. So again, we're concerned about public protection, public recourse in the facilities, and the healthcare practitioners that are providing veterinary care. I'd just like to reiterate that sheltering is not veterinary medicine. So for the sponsor to shelter animals in the state of California, obviously there are no provisions to require oversight or licensing or enforcement. However, if there is actual veterinary care being provided, that is where the board would very much like to see some authority for inspection. Thank you.
Councilman Mainshine, would you like to respond?
Yeah.
Because there seems some direct conflicts in the information.
Sure, we would be happy to have the inspections as part of it, and we have been. I'm glad to hear this position. We're more than happy to do that. I think it is important, and we have no problems with that at all.
I also noted that it sounds like the opposition is asserting that there aren't protocols, and I heard specifically you speak to the protocols. Could you respond to that?
Sure, yeah. Consistently in our discussions over this bill, it has been purported that current law does not authorize the ability for veterinarians to be called in from out of state. And that our bill somehow creates a new exemption for licensed veterinarians from other states to come in, and that those individuals would not be subject to any of the disciplinary actions that currently exist in California. All we're doing with 317 is utilizing the existing law, which already clearly says we agree there are a lot of veterinarians in California. No one's going to come and say there are not enough veterinarians in California. But the debate has already been had over whether or not the state should have the authority to call in out-of-state veterinarians, and what does that look like? BMP 900 gives that authority to the management authority. CDFA plays an integral role in that, which is why I referenced them, and why we're willing to make sure that we work with, we are asked, all we're asking for is that if we're asked to come in under those protocols, that we have the ability to do temporary sheltering. The ASPCA has been around for 150 years. We understand what veterinary medicine is and what sheltering is, and we care greatly for the animals that we are housing. When we deployed in Hurricane Sandy, many of the animals that entered our temporary shelter in Brooklyn, many had illnesses because they were stray on the streets. There were flood waters that maybe got them sick. Our veterinarians had to treat them, and we had special quarantine areas. We had special surgical areas, and the National Veterinary Response Team, even under the federal government, deployed with us to New York. So this isn't a situation where you have good-hearted animal welfare people who just want to help animals. You have trained individuals who have extensive training in disaster response, and we're just simply trying to clarify law. I don't understand personally the argument that our bill somehow expands the ability for out-of-state veterinarians to come into California. We can only come in if we're invited, and we can only come in under the current law authority that exists today.
Any other questions? Senator Jackson.
Yeah, here the competition here is between the veterinary association. It says we have enough vets here. We don't need more. And you're saying, look, we've got people who want to come in and help during a disaster. I think what I heard you say earlier is we don't really know statistically whether we are lacking sufficient access to vets during these critical situations or not. And that's where I think there's a bit of a disconnect. Could you respond to that? Is my information or is that analysis incorrect?
I think it's a great analysis. And this one I actually, to get to maybe Senator Hernandez's earlier question, this one I can actually speak from personal experience on. And I know as Senator Block remembers, the two largest disasters that we had in the history of San Diego both occurred in my city council district. And this was an issue there. As you know, we had all these people displaced from their homes. We had issues, obviously, with animals. It was not just particular to my council district because so many other people had to be evacuated, even though their homes weren't destroyed. They had to be evacuated. Some of them were in kind of the outside of the city central. In the city central, we kind of had dogs and cats were the issue. As you got further outside the urban areas, horses and other things became an issue as well. Clarifying that how you're going to go about providing temporary shelter, I think, is significant because anytime this hits any local government, I mean, we were stretched unbelievably thin, and we're the 7th largest city in the country. So for other people in this state, in all likelihood, it would probably be more problematic. So simply clarifying how, here's the procedures on temporary shelter, and it is true, absolutely, that local vet, you know, if this happens in San Diego vets are going to have first shot at all this. If for no other reason, then that's the simplest way to do it, right? They're there. There's no incentive for somebody else to provide this work except local. What ends up happening sometimes in some cases, depending on the size of the disaster, is who all is being displaced. We had vets in San Diego that weren't able to get to their place of business, obviously, because they were being kept out by the police. So all of these things, and admittedly, all of these things are going to be individual to what type of disaster hits what region. But what I can tell you with personal certainty, because I had to deal with it twice, and I really did pay attention to this issue because it was important to me personally. It was extremely difficult amongst the thousands of issues we were dealing with at that time. This one was difficult, and to be able to nail it down, to be able to go to the local city council member or mayor, whoever it is, and say, here's what your options are in this case, having that clarification, I do think is very significant.
I want to thank you for bringing the bill forward. I represent the San Joaquin, Sacramento Bay Delta area, all of the levees in the Central Valley, and we've had the experience when I was staff member to my predecessor, Senator Pat Johnston, and the floods were in 1997 when Friant Dam released the water and it overtopped our levees, and we had farmers who were worried about their cattle, and they were calling upon other farmers to move their cattle to higher ground to save their cattle and their horses and poultry, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't just about our pets that we think of, but these were livestock animals that all of a sudden we were challenged with how to address saving them. And I can tell you that when it all happened, it was a crisis, and OES, yes, they helped, but the state of emergency was declared after the urgency was addressed by those in the local area, who then waited for the state to respond and declare a state of emergency and provide assistance. So I think that it's important to enable locals to do what they need to do to take care of the crisis in the moment, because until OAS comes in, there's no time to look and see what the statutes are and what the law. You have local people on the ground that are responding to a crisis in the best way that they know how, and I think that this bill will enable that to happen.
Are you good?
I'll take Senator Galgiani's comments as my close. They were great.
Motion is due pass to Appropriations Hill. Bates.
Aye.
Bates, aye. Berryhill.
Aye.
Berryhill, aye. Block.
Aye.
Block, aye. Galgiani.
Aye.
Galgiani, aye. Hernandez.
Aye.
Hernandez, aye. Jackson.
Aye.
Jackson, aye. Mendoza. Rakowski.
6 votes.
6 votes on call.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members.
So we have Assemblymember Wood here.
Yeah, he's here. Okay.
Next bill is AB 320. Assemblymember Wood.
Thank you very much, Chair and members. AB 320. California leads the world in environmental policies and has implemented some of the most comprehensive environmental regulations in the world. We also lead the world in climate change standards as well and are continuing to address that in the legislature this year. AB 320 provides a path to licensure as environmental engineers for those professional engineers that do not fit under the scope of the existing practice and Title Acts. Currently, environmental engineers practice without the official licensure or regulations. As environmental programs continue to expand in scope and complexity, testing and certification of environmental engineers are needed to establish benchmarks for competency. A separate Title Act is needed because environmental engineers carry out tasks specific to soil science, chemistry, and biology, solving environmental problems by using their knowledge of engineering, pollution control, recycling, and public health issues. The current list of professional engineers does not cover these job duties, nor are they trained to do so. Testing and licensing establishes regulations for environmental engineers, will ensure a proper certification structure that will safeguard our communities. I should have mentioned in advance, I am taking the committee's amendments as well.
Okay.
And I will also say that two of the preeminent environmental engineering programs are in California. One is at Stanford and one is at Humboldt State University, which is in my assembly district. Here with me is Steve Baker on behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, Steve Baker with Aaron Reed & Associates, representing the professional engineers in California government, the sponsor of this measure. I think Assemblyman Wood did a great job outlining the need for this bill. I just point out that environmental engineers do important work to improve the natural environment, to provide healthy water, air, and land for human habitation. They design waste management projects. They work in the environmental areas that Assemblyman Wood outlined. We think that the work that they do should be regulated and that there should be a licensure program for them. In addition to the universities that Assemblyman Wood mentioned, there's 9 universities in California that offer an environmental engineering program. California is one of the few states in the nation that does not recognize these folks. We know that there are concerns, and that the Board of Registration believes that Title Act is not the ideal way of licensing these folks, but this committee's rejected proposals to eliminate the Title Acts and make them practice acts, so we think that it's the best thing that's achievable under the circumstances and would encourage your yes vote.
Very good, thank you. Are the witnesses in support? Witnesses in opposition? Maybe we've done that already. No, we haven't. Okay, very good. The vice chair is way ahead of me.
I forgot to tell you, Chair, I'm sorry.
No, that's right. Good afternoon. Yes.
Hello, thank you. I'm Nancy Eisler, the Assistant Executive Officer for the Board for Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists. The board is in opposition to this bill, either in its current form or as the proposed amendment. They would still be opposed to it. The board does not believe that simply regulating the title helps to protect the public. The practice that is associated with that title should also be regulated. That the goal of the board is for consumer protection, and that is what state licensure should indicate, and simply regulating a title use by individuals is not sufficient public protection. The statements by the proponents of this measure about the need for regulation in this area sound more like they're talking about regulating the practice, which would be what would be needed if this is something that is needed for consumer protection. The practice should be regulated along with the title. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Others in opposition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Keith Dunn on behalf of the American Council of Engineering Companies. And I'm not used to being in opposition to Mr. Baker on this issue. For the last 15 or 20 years, we have together stood against the expansion of the Title Act. So in a little unique position opposing this. We do support and understand the professional nature of those that graduate with engineering, environmental engineering degrees, and don't want to detract from their contributions to our great state and the work that they do. We do believe, however, that the board is correct and that regulating the practice is really what we're talking about here. And expansion of the Title Acts is really not something that we have supported traditionally either. Not to take away from their great contributions, but we do agree with the board that the practice should be regulated, not the title.
Very good, thank you. Others in opposition? Seeing no one, bringing it back to the committee. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Would you like to respond to some of the opposition, Mr. Wood?
Well, and with all due respect, I would beg to differ on the issue. Granted, this is a Title Act provision, a change. I think it's a step in the direction we need to go. I believe it is a consumer protection oriented act. I think that people actually do go out and have expended a tremendous amount of time in their education to achieve a degree in environmental engineering, and I think they ought to be able to use that. I also don't believe that people who do not have that kind of an educational background should use that. I think that that's where the consumer protection comes in. I agree that maybe we need to be going further with further legislation as how we ultimately do that, but that's not what's before us today. I'm looking to ask for your support on moving forward with this change in the Title Act.
Very good. I thank you, and I take that as your close.
It is. Thank you.
And I would agree with you. I was impressed with the 9 schools and that offer the degree in environmental engineering, as well as the issue of the national test that is geared specifically for environmental engineering. And we could do a title, but it should probably be practice, and that may be the next step for it at some point in time. But I do think there's some consumer protection related to it as well. So is there a motion? Motion by Senator Block. Thank you very much. Please call the roll.
Motion is due pass as amended to appropriations. Hill?
Aye.
Hill, aye. Bates?
No.
Bates, no. Berryhill? Block?
Aye.
Block, aye. Galgiani? Aye. Galgiani, aye. Hernandez?
Aye.
Hernandez, aye. Jackson? Aye. Jackson, aye. Mendoza? Wachowski?
5. The bill has 5 votes. We'll hold the roll open for absent members. Thank you very much.
Go to Gordon.
Who's here? Oh, there, Assemblymember Gordon. Welcome. You were off to the side, Rich. Didn't see you. I'm looking there, not over there. Welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.